Hello and welcome to this video where we will be discussing supporting students with disruptive behavior disorders. My name is Billy Pitcher. I am a high school teacher in Illinois at Lake Park High School. Let's discuss the objectives of today's presentation. We want to define what DBD, disruptive behavior disorder, is. We'll look at the background and causes of disruptive behavior disorder. Look at some examples and symptoms of disruptive behavior disorder, then get into some methods you can use as a classroom teacher, both as general education and special education teacher, for working with DBD students. When to involve the student support team and some school-wide approaches. So defining disruptive behavior disorder, there are many definitions out there of disruptive behavior disorder. Essentially, it is a group of conditions that involve violating the rights and desires of other people. So disruptive behaviors by students that disrupt others. They create significant conflict with authority figures and general unhealthy functioning in society. And I think as teachers, much like as parents, the goal for parents of their children, just like teachers of students, is to create and help nurture someone to be a positive, productive member of society. And that is the issue with a lot of students that have this disruptive behavior disorder, is the unhealthy functioning in society. Disruptive impulse control conduct disorders affect the individual's abilities to control their emotions and behavior. And as a result, sometimes their behavior may injure themselves or injure others. Ongoing patterns of hostile behaviors that children and adolescents direct toward others, typically to any type of authority figure, and that is a large issue with disruptive behavior disorders. It's generally towards authority figures. It could be defiance to teachers, parents, coaches, other adults, acting against societal norms, involve violence or the threat of violence, engaging in illegal behaviors such as stealing. DBD students have had history of showing destruction of property, aggressiveness or cruelty to animals, emotional outbursts and tantrums. Any of these type of behaviors that you exhibit could identify a student as suffering from this disorder of disruptive behavior disorder. Or symptoms of disruptive behavior disorder: arguing with others frequently, refusing to do what is asked of them, annoying people intentionally, blaming others for their mistakes instead of taking the accountability for their own actions and mistakes. When criticism is given, being overly sensitive and having a difficult time internalizing that feedback and that constructive criticism. Feeling resentful or hostile towards others, lying, starting fires. All examples and symptoms of disruptive behavior disorder. Disruptive behavior disorder can also be related to or similar to conduct disorder. Many students who have disruptive behavior disorder also suffer from attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and emotional and behavior disorder. So these can accompany disruptive behavior disorder and certainly contribute to it. So let's talk about what causes disruptive behavior disorder. Why are these students, why are these children acting in this way of defiance and opposition and anger and resentment and physical violence? Well, it's really a combination. The science and research has indicated that it's a combination of hereditary, environmental, and physical factors. They could be acting this way as a result of substance abuse. They could be acting this way as a result of living in poverty. These students may be the victims of physical or sexual abuse as infants or as young children. There may have been neglect or rejection of them by parental figures, and this is their way of acting out from that. They may have been foster care or had poor foster care. Oftentimes, students with DBD were born low birth rates, as premature babies. And there could be some neurological damage at birth or as an infant. So a lot of times we may encounter these students when they get to the middle school or high school level and be frustrated with their behavior, and certainly the list of symptoms and behaviors and dealing with that is frustrating as an educator. But it's important to look at these symptoms and realize that these students oftentimes are victims, really, of their circumstances and their environment, and they were not given the same start as their peers in many situations. So it's important as educators to be aware of these factors and be there to support and help these students to overcome the unfortunate background and experiences that they had earlier in their life. And one of the ways that it's supported is through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. And this is a quote directly from the IDEA, where they look to support students with disabilities, and specifically students with disruptive behavior disabilities are supported in this context as well. And the goal of this, the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, and other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So what they're saying here, the IDEA, is let's not restrain these students in a special education only classroom. That is not in their best interest moving forward. And as I mentioned earlier about the goal of making these students positive, productive members of society, they need to be in classes with children who do not have these same disabilities, and work towards an environment where they can be in general education classes more and more. And so this refers to the educational term, the least restrictive environment. And students with the disruptive behavior disorder should be placed in the least restrictive environment. The goal is to include these students, regular education students with the disruptive behavior students into as many mainstream classes as possible. Until that can occur, the DBD students will be placed in special education classes and work towards going to more of those classes by starting them in the specials, having them go to art class, travel to music or PE, and in which case, if there are concerns about that transition, an aide or a paraprofessional would accompany them to those special classes, kind of a bridge to work up towards going to more and eventually, hopefully, all regular education classes. I brought up the term seclusion and restraint, and this is a practice that is used with many disruptive behavior students throughout the country when they are acting in a way that is frustrating to teachers or is aggressive or perhaps even violent or emotional outbursts. Two of the strategies that have been used are restraint and seclusion with them. And by definition, restraint is to restrict the student's movement. This could be holding and using devices like straps to keep them still. It could also be using medication to make them more docile and less out of control. The seclusion means to isolate the student in a room or space that they're physically prevented from leaving from. They're told by an authority figure they can't leave, or they're locked in the room. Some classrooms around the country have a room within a room for students, almost like a solitary confinement type situation. But these should really be used as last resorts and only be used when the students pose a serious threat to themselves or to others. In that case, then educators, to protect themselves and protect their colleagues or other students, they would need to restrain them in a separate space. But again, this is a last resort situation. And too many times in education, it seems that this is being used as a first resort or or second resort, and perhaps too soon. A couple examples of this from readings found at Virginia School, where it had 220 students, but had more than 6,600 incidents of restraint and 1,500 instances of seclusion. So that means the same students are over and over and over being restrained and being secluded. And clearly that is not a path towards success or a path towards the least restrictive environment if that's having to occur again and again and again. And one of the teachers there is quoted as saying that restraint and seclusion was our go-to technique. And I said this needs to be the last resort. And when you think about a student who is going through an emotional outburst or having a really bad day and is frustrated, try to put yourselves in their shoes and think about what you would want. If you were having a bad day, maybe you would need some space, someone to be kind to you, read a book, go for a walk. The worst thing really is to say, we're going to restrain you, we're going to seclude you and withhold you, and that's what's happening. And instead of diffusing these situations, it's only exacerbating them and making it worse. There was another case with a boy with autism and behavior issues in the school, was restrained or secluded more than 400 times. So there's many of these examples and stories with this, and there's data that exists here on restraint and seclusion that has been compiled and broken down based by race and by gender. And I've included this link on the presentation here if you want to look at this more. But I find it fascinating, the breakdown in percentages of students in harassment, bullying, and this is put together by the Civil Rights Data Collection. So that information is interesting there, and again goes to this the method of restraint and seclusion. So what can we do instead of these methods before we get to that last resort? And this is strategies that can support these students with disruptive behavior disorders and help move them to that general education classroom on a more consistent basis. As teachers, both special education and general education teachers that have students with disruptive behavior disorders, it's important to keep the class rules and activities simple and clear. Instead of presenting notes and just giving them a blank piece of paper, perhaps providing these students with guided notes so they can help them follow along. Using games, with clickers are effective as well. Continuing to be active and involve the students, as opposed to forcing them to just sit there and maybe a quiet dark room and take notes and not talk, not get up, not move. That's difficult for these students. It's also important to reward their positive behaviors. We've heard over and over how positive reinforcement is more effective than negative reinforcement. But continue to do that and reward that positive behavior. They will start to see you as the teacher as more of an ally, as opposed to an adversary who's constantly criticizing them. Remember, back to one of the symptoms was that students with disruptive behavior disorders have a difficult time with criticism. So focus more on the positives. Going back to the activities with number 3, allow for mini breaks. A lesson that involves lecturing the entire period is difficult for a student with disruptive behavior disorders. Mix in a video, mix up an opportunity to work in small groups, where you break up the period, allow them to cool off, go for a walk, get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, as long as they're not abusing that. Also providing fair, consistent treatment. I think if these students see that other students are being treated differently, they're allowed to walk in late, they're allowed to, be out of their seat or, on a phone or something of that nature, that can trigger a cascade of negative emotions where, again, these students have had a tough start in their life to begin with. They've most likely been treated unfairly, and now here's going to be just another example they can draw to of feeling like they can't trust adults or are being treated unfairly. So it's important to be fair and consistent. And one of the biggest and most important ones is a teacher dealing with students with disruptive behavior disorders is your own behavior. Modeling a calm, poised approach in how you teach the class and how you're working with the students. If you're raising your voice and you're losing your cool, then that justifies the student doing the same thing. So there certainly will be times where your blood may boil, your emotions may rise. A teacher in dealing with the students, but it's so important to remain calm and as consistent as possible. Remain that way, so that way they see that and they can model that. When the child does get upset, instead of losing your cool and getting upset as well, try to validate the child's emotions. Instead of being judgmental of them, be empathetic to them. You can talk to them about how I know you're upset. I can see why you're upset. I would be frustrated too. And try to understand that, and then work with them. Into number 7, how do you cope? How do we handle this? We can't choose our emotions, but we can choose how we react to our emotions. And it's okay to get frustrated or get angry. We all are passionate about things, but then how do we react to that? Do we react to that by punching a wall, by hitting things, by throwing things, being destructive to property or hurting others? Is there a better way we can manifest that? And that gets to helping them find emotional outlets. This is a huge part of having a healthy emotional life, is learning how to channel those emotions, the positive, constructive things, talking it out. Maybe it's exercise. Has been proven to really reduce stress. They can get it out that way, cooling off, again, allowing them that time and space to do that. And I really think number 9 is an overlooked area that is important here, and that is, having the opportunity to take up some sort of form of self-expression. This could be, dance or playing an instrument, painting, writing, taking up a sport. These students all have, that they're people that have their own interests and activities. And what is it that excites them? What is it that makes them happy? Is it playing a sport? Is it poetry? Is it art or music? What is it that makes them happy? And find that connection with those students, and also look at the people other people that are taking part in these activities and are very successful, whether it be a professional musician or athlete or whatever. And what did they have to do to become that? They had to overcome some challenges and hurdles, just like these students are having to overcome those challenges and hurdles. And there's times where things didn't go their way as well. And how do they handle that? And so I think that encouraging them to be involved in these activities, and then use them as a springboard to help work with their emotions and frustrations. Some of the research and theory behind these practices that we're looking at there, that the strategies that to help students. B.F. Skinner's operant learning theory aligns with this idea of reinforcement. The power of reinforcement, the power of positive reinforcement, and how that strengthens the student and reinforces the idea. Let's keep doing those activities, and the negative reinforcement, and instilling those same frustration moments in them, and that's not positive. So anything that strengthens a desired response, like stickers, candy, praises, smiles, is really going to be helpful. Another theory, Bandura's social learning theory, is that people learn from one another. Observation, imitation, modeling. Well, like we talked about before, with as a teacher modeling that behavior. Having students get into those activities that I mentioned, joining a club or a sport, or being involved in music, that they can see their peers, their classmates, or their heroes, their role models, and so forth, and modeling the positive behaviors that they have as well. teachers not only in the classroom, but you're walking out of school and you're in the parking lot, you're in your car and you're going, going off and you speed off or something, little things like that. As teachers, so important in terms of how you portray yourself on social media, in the community. So it's, when you're a teacher, that responsibility really does, whether we like it or not, extend beyond the classroom. And so it's important that we do the best in that area to model those behaviors in and out of the classroom, just like we want our students to carry those behaviors out of the classroom as well, into real life. So what can we do, as teachers in a school-wide approach here? There's some other options for the least restrictive environment for students with disruptive behavior disorders. One method that's been very successful is co-teaching. And again, like a bridge to go from a fully secluded environment to being more inclusive here. The co-taught classroom is one where you have the special education teacher and the general education teacher in there. So the benefits of having the content knowledge of the general education teacher, and then a little more of the one-on-one option there, and help and aid when needed from the special ed teacher. Kind of a unique approach here, similar to co-teaching, is the push-in and pull-out methods. So the push-in support is there's no co-planned or taught lesson, just individual support and focus on students with IEPs. So they come in, and the student gets to stay in the classroom, the regular education classroom, and this special ed teacher will pop in and kind of hop around and notice where students need help, or students who raise their hand and need help, and make sure that they get the accommodations provided by their individualized education plan. The opposite of the push-in is the pull-out, where then students are taken out of the regular education class and put into a special education environment for part of the period or one period, maybe to have a little more quiet environment to take a test, or to feel a little bit safer with a presentation, not having to do that in front of the rest of the class. And it just kind of reduce some of the risk, the learning risk in small group settings versus the large group setting there. Some other triggers, such as test taking, understanding like that. What are the triggers that get these students to have the emotional outburst and act in a way that is disruptive? It's the pressure of taking a test. It's the pressure of presenting a project or having to write this essay in 50 minutes or whatever the deadline is. And that builds up on all students, but especially for students with disruptive behavior disorders. So working with the special education department, counselors, and so on, to make sure that these students are given extended time, alternate test setting, and things like Google dictation for writing essays to help them get that done a little bit quicker, so they're not frustrated on those ideas when they have the information, but they're not able to get it down in time. Then that stress of writing it down causes them to not be as effective in writing their essay. So again, the idea is support these students, accommodate these students. There's a short video on disruptive behavior disorders. It aligns with many of the things that we've been discussing.
For a child that age, conduct disorders are the most common mental health disorder in children. Prevalence runs at about 5% overall for the age of 10. It's more common in boys. Boys, it's about 7%, and girls, about 3%. The most common type of conduct disorder in primary school age children is called oppositional defiant disorder. It's also known as oppositional defiant disorder can present with persistent defiant behavior, arguing with adults and actively defying or refusing adults' requests or rules. They may seem spiteful or vindictive, touchy, and easily annoyed by others. Severe temper tantrums might be frequent, and children may generally seem angry or resentful. They may deliberately annoy other people and blame others for their own mistakes or misbehavior. One of the characteristics of full-blown conduct disorder is that there tends to be a victim of the behaviors. It's less about arguing and being defiant, and it's more about hurting and perhaps causing damage to people or to property. Children with conduct disorder can present with a range of violent and destructive behaviors. These might include aggression and fighting, perhaps with weapons, and frequently lying. In the most extreme cases, cruelty to animals and fire setting. One distinction that we sometimes make is between socialized and unsocialized conduct disorder. The difference with the socialized conduct disorder is that the child maintains good social relationships. They may even do some of the behaviors with other children. Probably more worrying is the unsocialized child with conduct problems who doesn't have peer relationships, isn't very good at social interactions, and they are more solitary, committing these types of behaviors. An interesting distinction we sometimes make with children with conduct disorder is in terms of whether they have lower levels of guilt and remorse about their actions. And it's very important to think about this because it can predict a more severe and enduring form of conduct problem. Children with conduct disorder are quite likely to suffer from other mental health conditions. One of the most common would be ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. A significant minority of children with conduct disorder will suffer from a depressive or anxiety disorder as well. And these disorders are often missed because of the focus on the behavioural problems. But it is very important to remember that children with conduct disorder aren't just bad, they can also be sad. A child may only be experiencing behaviour problems at home and not at school. A parent may feel misunderstood if the difficulties they're experiencing at home aren't understood at school. If the parents are not experiencing difficulties at home and the difficulties only occur at school, it may be hard for them to recognise and accept that you're finding problems with their child in the classroom. There are a number of reasons why a child might develop a conduct disorder. Inconsistent and harsh parenting, conflict within the home, child abuse, exposure to substance abuse, extreme poverty, or parental mental health difficulties, or being involved with child protection services. These can all affect a child's behaviour. It's important to recognise that these factors can interact with each other. It's important not to think about one or two in isolation. In the short term, conduct disorder can impact upon educational attainments. It can lead to elevated stress within the family, and it can also impair the child's ability to make effective and good peer relationships. In the longer term, children with conduct disorder are more likely to have difficult family relationships, a poorer work history, and end up in the criminal justice system. Parents and teachers can help children with conduct disorders by being aware that it's very easy to get into a pattern of paying attention to children's negative behaviours. Adults tend to pay more attention to the negative behaviours that the child is showing, and much less to the positive behaviours. And we know that children are driven to seek attention from adults, so this cycle gets embedded. You should think about making a referral to mental health services for conduct disorder if a child's behaviour in the classroom is really quite different to other children. Bear in mind that many children will show these behaviours from time to time. The key thing is to notice when they become a significant problem for the child's learning or with their interactions with their friends and peers. If you suspect a child has a conduct problem, you can make a referral to the child's GP or via a SENCO in school, and potentially to your local child and adolescent mental health service or CAM service. Many children show challenging behaviour at times, but when this becomes much more frequent and severe than other children their age, or it's having a big impact on your household, or on the child's ability to engage in education or make and keep friendships, then it is time to seek help.
So I think it's important to see that video and reinforce as many of the things that we have discussed in this presentation. And I think the big theme is that we as educators need to be allies with these students and be empathetic and understand the difficult background that they've had and work to help them overcome that and find those supports and work with our fellow teachers, special education department, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, administration to provide the supports that are necessary to help these students be successful and be positive members of society, as opposed to ending up in the same cycle, perhaps, of poverty that they discussed in the video, or crime, difficulty with jobs, and so on. So to wrap up our presentation, let's have a fun little acronym matching activity here. Throughout the presentation, there's been a lot of acronyms that have been presented. DBD, IDEA, LRE, ODD, ADHD, EBD. So what does DBD stand for? We mentioned it many times throughout the presentation. Yep, that's Disruptive Behavior Disorder. IDEA, you know what those letters stand for. Yeah, that's Individualized Disabilities Education Act. The LRE, right? Simply want to move these DBD students to the LRE, which is the least restrictive environment. We don't want to restrain them or seclude them. We want to include them. Another one, similar to disruptive behavior disorder, students that show ODD, means oppositional defiant disorder. That oppositional defiant disorder, very common with students with disruptive behavior disorders. Also, ADHD, very common. Students with disruptive behavior disorders are oftentimes students who also suffer from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And EBD, emotional and behavior disorder. So a lot of acronyms in education, a lot of acronyms related to disruptive behavior disorders as well. Some more DBD facts here. There's a couple more ones here in this last slide. DBD is caused by a combination of physical, environmental, and hereditary factors. Is that true or false? That is true. Yes, there are a lot of circumstances that these students have been dealt a difficult hand, whether it be from birth or from the environment, or physical things that have happened to them that cause them to act in the way that they do. That's why we're here to understand and support them and be their allies. The goal of DBD students is to keep them in an inclusive special education classroom for as long as possible. Is that true or false? And that is false. We want to move them out of that environment, just like the society that they will be in as adults will be an inclusive one. So they need to be prepared for that. And education environment will help to prepare them for that. DBD students are more likely to be females than males. That's also false. It's more likely to be male students than female students. DBD students respond better to positive reinforcement instead of the threat or fear of consequences related to negative behavior. And that is true. Positive reinforcement proven to be better. Thank you very much for watching this presentation. Here is a list of references to learn more about the information that we discussed, and look forward to answering any questions that you may have at this time. Feel free to email me or review this video or the links on YouTube. Have a great day.